Hi, welcome to this webinar on Zerto Virtual Replication for Microsoft Hyper-V. My name is Joshua Stenhouse. I'm the Technical Marketing Manager at Zerto. I've been with Zerto since September 2012, and before that I was actually a customer of Zerto where I trialed, bought and installed the software for replicating my virtual machines between my two VMware data centers. And the reason I bought it was because Zerto provides enterprise-class virtual replication BCDR solutions for data centers and the cloud. And over the last couple of years, we've been the best solution for replicating between VMware environments, but we've had the same questions and challenges brought to us from you guys out there that are either running or considering Hyper-V. And I can summarize those as these following questions in that, how can you provide enterprise class virtual BCDR in and to and from a Microsoft Hyper-V based environment? How can you protect, migrate and recover your virtual machines between your hypervisors? Because it's becoming more and more common to see multiple hypervisors in an enterprise data center where you might be using Hyper-V for your dev test, or you might even be using it for your satellite offices. Irrespective of the hypervisor, a consistent challenge that comes up is how can you recover your multi-VM applications to the same point in time? And if you do have multiple hypervisors and you require BCDR, then how do you manage the BCDR between the hypervisors from a single consistent interface without requiring many more multiple skill sets than you already need? And then finally, how do you remove the hypervisor lock-in? And this question was brought to me, I think, back in 2008. I can remember my IT director saying to me, Josh, we need to look at using Hyper-V due to licensing and that we're pretty much already paying for it. Again, in 2010 and also in 2011, in different various roles and companies, I kept being asked the same question, and each time I could quite easily bat it off because I said, Hyper-V, even though it can be much cheaper, it's not quite there on a feature level. But actually, having used Hyper-V for the last couple of months now as part of this release for Zerto, I think if I was to go into a role tomorrow, then with all the features that I'm going to talk about today that Zerto is releasing for Hyper-V, I think my answer to that question is going to be a lot different going forward. And the solution is, of course, Zerto has announced our support for replication, migration and recovery of virtual machines between Hyper-V environments. So you now have the same solution that we've been delivering for the last few years between VMware data centers for your Microsoft Hyper-V environment. So it's no longer restricted to just your dev test workloads. You can really start to consider Hyper-V as a realistic alternative for your tier 1 and tier 2 virtual machines and applications. But we haven't just delivered replication between Hyper-V instances. We've also enabled replication from Hyper-V to VMware and VMware to Hyper-V with complete automatic VM conversion. So this is just absolutely out there. It's probably the coolest thing I've ever seen since I first saw Zerto and I saw the continuous replication with the recovery point objective of seconds. To see the same thing running to and from Hyper-V and VMware just is absolutely amazing, and I'll show you this in the demo later on. And hopefully you're excited now and you're starting to think of all of the different possibilities that this now enables, because you don't have to limit your choices on the hypervisor, in that when it's hypervisor agnostic BCDR, if you want to have a centralized VMware data center, multiple satellite offices using Hyper-V, you can have replication of the VMs from the satellite offices into your centralized VMware data center, no problem. Or if you want to use VMware in production and Hyper-V in your DR site to utilize that Hyper-V licensing that you might already have, then this is now a realistic option for you to consider. So it really is very cool in what is now possible when you abstract the hypervisor from the BCDR process. And just to cover the pre-install requirements for Zerto and Hyper-V, if you've installed Zerto in a VMware environment, you will see some big similarities because it's pretty much exactly the same. And so in a VMware environment, just as you need a vCenter, in Microsoft Hyper-V, we need a System Center Virtual Machine Manager, which has to be a minimum of 2012 R2, and that's simply so that Zerto can orchestrate and automate the recovery process of the virtual machines. We need a management VM on which to install the Zerto management service, which should be a minimum of Server 2008 R2 onwards, with 2 vCPUs, 4 GB of RAM, 40 GB of disk space, and a static IP address. The Hyper-V servers themselves have to be 2012 R2, and whether that's full-blown Windows with the Hyper-V role or the server core Hyper-V edition is completely up to you, as long as they're registered to that system center. They can be using any kind of storage, whether it's direct attached or cluster shared volumes. It's completely up to you. And the WAN link needs to be a minimum of 5 meg symmetric available bandwidth, meaning both up and down. In terms of the architecture installation, you install the Zerto Virtual Manager service in the management VM that you pre-provisioned, and then you pair the two Zerto managers together. Each Zerto manager is where you manage all of the orchestration, the automation, and the protection and the failovers, and it's just by a simple HTTPS hostname of the Zerto manager on port 9669. The Zerto manager orchestrates all of the tasks to the system center, and it's currently validated up to a maximum 5,000 virtual machines, but it will go beyond this. It's just that what it's currently validated to without having to increase the minimum spec on the Zerto manager. From the Zerto manager interface, you then need to deploy the Zerto replication appliances to each Hyper-V host that you're replicating from and to. And there's no impact to this VRA deployment. It's just one vCPU, 1 to 3 GB of RAM, 12 GB of disk space, one static IP address per appliance, and there isn't a VM limitation. It's actually a number of virtual disks, which is currently 500 maximum per replication appliance. So straight away, if you're very familiar with Zerto, as I said, you can see this is exactly the same architecture as it is in VMware, as it is in Hyper-V. And it's also the exact same management interface, and here you can see a sneak preview of the new Zerto 4.0 GUI, and hopefully you'll agree it's very sexy, but the really cool thing is that whether you're using VMware or Hyper-V, it's completely abstracted and it looks exactly the same, it works exactly the same, which significantly reduces the complexity and the management overheads because it's just one BCDR solution irrespective of whatever's running the virtual machines below. We have the site-wide statistics for both the total protection groups, VMs in those protection groups, the gigabyte of data protected, the average recovery point objective across the board, and the real-time compression ratio of the replication traffic that's being achieved. We've also introduced improved workflows for bulk operations, and all this means is that when you're creating VMs in protection groups in larger environments, then bulk operations such as changing the IP address on 30 different VMs simultaneously is now much easier and requires a lot less clicks in the new Zerto GUI. When you're configuring the VM replication in Hyper-V, we have the same concept of the virtual protection group, which is still the consistency grouping of the virtual machines on a per application basis. So a perfect example being your SharePoint farm. If it consists of 6 different VMs, you place them in the protection group and the recovery is to a consistent point in time and you recover the application, not just the data. When you're configuring the protection group, you set the boot order of the virtual machines, allowing you to bring, for example, database servers online in front of everything else. You set your target site to replicate to, be it VMware or Hyper-V, and then you set the SLAs around the protection. You configure the target storage and any preceding if you just want to send the delta changes and not send a copy of the whole disks. You configure the networking and the scripts and in terms of which port groups you want to connect to, any IP addresses that you want to change. You then configure your long-term retention policy if you want to keep the data longer than the 5-day journal that we currently configure. And then you click to create the protection group and we perform an initial sync of the data. And then it doesn't matter whether you're using Hyper-V or VMware. In this diagram here, you can see it just says Hypervisor because for us it now does not matter. And irrespective, you get the same continuous replication of the block level changes near synchronously on a per VM basis between any different storage array. So from anything to anything, as I said, with no vendor lock-in. With the built-in compression of the replication appliances, which allows bandwidth throttling on a site-wide or on a time schedule basis, and then you can prioritize the replication of applications using our built-in quas within that limitation. And all of this together means that even if it's VMware to VMware, Hyper-V to Hyper-V, or vice versa, we're still delivering the same recovery point objective of just seconds. So it's real-time replication with a data loss of just seconds. And we do this with no snapshots or checkpoints, therefore no performance impact in the protected virtual machines and applications. The replication is fully virtual aware with support for live migration, storage live migration, and failover clustering. We keep a journal of all the changes in the recovery site, which automatically resizes to meet the SLAs defined, and the journal is simply the size of the data changing in the time frame specified. So if, for example, you want to keep 24 hours of change in order to roll back in time and 24 gigabytes changes, then the journal will be 24 gigabytes. But Zerto will actually reclaim that space back if, for example, on day 2, the data change rate drops down to 2 gigabytes. And this journal allows you to recover and rewind the virtual machines to increments every few seconds, up to 5 days in the past. And that's simply done when you click to recover with this checkpoint dialog box that you can see here, where you can see that you have the ability to rewind and select the thousands of points in time, which means we're not just protecting against disasters, we're protecting against logical failures such as a database corruption or a user error, because you can simply rewind to the point in time from a few seconds ago, not the last backup or snapshot. It supports both crash and application consistency, and importantly that all of the VMs in the protection group, so for your multi-VM application, they are all recovered to the exact same checkpoint and the timestamp selected here. Now I'm sure at this point you're asking, how does Zerto actually do this cross-hypervisor VM conversion? And it's very important to understand that when you create the protection group, the virtual machine's disks are pre-created in the target hypervisor using its native disk format. Because Zerto is just doing block level replication and we copy the disk configuration, we don't have to do any sort of post-conversion of the disks, increasing the recovery time. It's just simply replicating the blocks from, for example, the VMDK to the VHDX. In terms of the VM guest tools, then if you're replicating to VMware from Hyper-V, we recommend installing the VM tools in advance, and you should do that by migrating the VM, installing the tools, and then migrating it back to ensure that your recovery time objective is reduced. And then from VMware to Hyper-V, then if it's Server 2012 onwards, then the host integration tools are installed in advance. And just so you know that we do have it on the roadmap to automatically do this in the future, but even when we have that, I will still recommend installing the guest tools in advance to significantly reduce the RTO. Any NICs that you have in the virtual machine are automatically converted, and we keep the exact same IP and MAC address. And if you're replicating from Hyper-V to VMware, the NICs are converted to E1000 adapters. And even if you're failing back, we'll actually completely reverse the conversion process. So it's not one way only, it's not just for migration, it is full conversion for both failover and failback between the hypervisors. Which means with the Zerto disaster recovery automation, we're still delivering the RTO of minutes, with the VMs powered on in the new hypervisor, with boot ordering, IP and MAC address changes, connecting the NICs to different port groups with any pre and post failover scripts that you define. You have the same ability to test the failover in an isolated bubble network, which means you can do the DR testing in working hours with no impact in production and no break in the replication. and importantly, see just how your virtual machines will behave in the target hypervisor if it's different to source. The failover testing uses a scratch disk, so the size of the test is simply the size of the changes occurring in the test, which is then deleted when the test is stopped, which allows us to do this testing without breaking the replication. And failback is as simple as a single checkbox where we automatically reverse the replication and start sending just the block changes back to production, ready for failback. And you can also click to change those settings if you need a different configuration for the failback recovery. So what I'd now like to do is take you through a demo of Zerto Virtual Replication for Hyper-V and also demo some of the functionality that we have for replication between the hypervisors as well. And in my demo environment here, I actually have two data centers. I have a Boston data center and a London data center. In both of these, I have both Hyper-V and VMware infrastructures. We have vCenter for each, or a system center, and then each of these has a Zerto virtual manager with at least one Hyper-V or ESXi host, and then a Zerto virtual replication appliance deployed to that host. On each of these hosts, I have one application to replicate and protect, which is going to be my CRM application. And what I'm going to demonstrate is my CRM app 1 virtual protection group, replicating and recovering from Hyper-V to Hyper-V, CRM app 2 from Hyper-V to VMware, CRM app 3 from VMware to VMware, and then finally, to complete the full demonstration, we'll have CRM app 4 from VMware to Hyper-V. Now, this might not be the most typical of use cases, and you might not have your environment configured in such a way, but all I'm showing you is each different possible way of replicating between the hypervisors, so you get a feel for exactly what is and isn't possible. So I'm now going to cut across and go to my demo lab. Now, in my demo environment here, this is my Boston Data Center Zerto Virtual Manager for my Hyper-V instance. And I'm replicating from this Hyper-V instance to the second, where I have a London Hyper-V Zerto Virtual Manager. And if we come back here, we can see the overall protection group health, the status of the current protection, so how many protection groups we have protected, the number of virtual machines that make up those protection groups, the total amount of data protected, the average recovery point objective across the board, and then the real-time compression. So you can see this is a really great screen to have up on a screen in your IT department to show the current level of protection that you have and the general health of the BCDR solution. So the first protection group that I said I would demo is my CRM app 1 protection group, replicating from Boston DC1 to London DC2 between the Hyper-V instances. And you can see in the actual recovery point objective column for the CRM app 1 with the real-time continuous replication showing a just data loss of just seconds with no snapshots or checkpoints and no performance impact inside the protected virtual machine. If we go to the setup and then the VRA tab, then you can see this is a screen where we deploy and manage the virtual replication appliances from. And it looks exactly the same as you would have it in a VMware environment because, as I said in the presentation, you deploy one virtual replication appliance for each ESXi or Hyper-V host. So just to show you what that relates to in terms of the infrastructure behind, if I go to my two SC-VMM servers for Boston here, we can see I have my SC-VMM server, a Zerto Virtual Manager, a virtual replication appliance, and my CRM app 1 application there. If we come across here for my DC2, then I have a second SC-VMM server, second Zerto Manager, and another virtual replication appliance, and also my CRM app 2 application. So what we're now going to do is perform a test failover of this CRM application to show it coming online in my target Hyper-V site. So if I click on the test failover option and we select CRM app 1, next, here we can see the new checkpoint field with the ability to select the previous points in time to roll back to, and you can really see that it is increments every few seconds, and it is a maximum of 5 days in the past that you can go back to. But just for this demo, I'm going to leave it on the latest point in time. And if we click next and then start failover test, and This is not a complete version of the new Zerto. It is a pre-beta release, so not all of the graphics that you'll see are, full representations of what it will look like, but you get an understanding of the underlying functionality that you're going to get here. So we can see Zerto is starting the failover test, and if we just come to the SC VMM server behind, what we'll see in a second is Zerto creating the failover test VMs in this target SC VMM server. It will connect them to an isolated port group, so they cannot communicate with production, but they can communicate with each other. And then in a second, we'll be able to log into my CRM-App1 web server and actually see my CRM application come online and perform a successful DR test. But just while we're waiting for Zerto to perform these operations and bring this application online, the important thing is if we come back into the source SV VMM server, we can see that my CRM-App1 application, all of the VMs are still powered on and they're still online servicing requests. And if we go to the Zerto Virtual Manager and view the protection group itself, then we can see that it is still meeting its SLA and replicating with a recovery point objective of seconds. So what you're seeing here is that between your two Hyper-V instances, you can have the continuous replication with no checkpoints or snapshots, and then the ability to click to test and show and prove the recovery in a matter of minutes with no break in the replication and no impact in production, which, as I'm sure you'll agree, is extremely powerful. This kind of functionality is very new to Hyper-V, especially with the CDP engine. Nothing else has been able to do this before. So this is revolutionary, groundbreaking stuff for your Microsoft Hyper-V environments. So we can see Zerto still performing the operations to bring on the failover test VMs in the target site, and we're just going to wait a few more seconds for these to start coming online because they're just VMs in the inventory. In a moment, I'll be able to load the console so you can actually log into this VM, check that the data is there, that it's consistent, that the services load, and that the application, most important of all, actually works. Zerto has now built the failover test, as you can see on the screen here, and if I switch back to my system center, we can see that all three of the VMs that form my CRM-App1 application are now booted and running, and if I load the console on my web server, then we can actually check and see what is happening with our CRM application. So here I'm just running Sugar CRM, log in with my default username and password, and let's see if this is a successful test. Just while I'm logging in, we can see that I can access the file system, all of the files are there, and we've successfully logged in, loading the default page, all of the records are there, and this is a simple but successful DR test of my CRM application between my system centers and my Hyper-V servers using Zerto. So I'm just going to close down this console, and in Zerto I'm going to click to stop the test. And it might seem a small innocuous feature, but it's actually very important in that we're asking for the user acceptance in terms of it being a success or failure, and allowing you to add in notes as to what actually happened. And that's because Zerto knows that we successfully registered and powered on these VMs, but most importantly we're asking, did the application actually work? So I'll just put in that note there, I'll click stop. And then if we come back to the system center, what we're going to see is Zerto automatically deleting, stopping, removing these failover test VMs, deleting the scratch disk and any changes that we made in the failover test VMs, but keeping an up-to-date copy of everything that we're replicating in the meantime, showing you the ability to do this testing in working hours very easily. And then just as you can in the VMware environments, you can produce PDF reports detailing the outcome of the testing. And just to show you a generated example from a previous system, I can show you here in this recovery report, you can see for each protection group the recovery operation details in terms of who performed the test, how long it took, the outcome, the recovery site settings, and the detailed recovery steps undertaken by Zerto. And if you really want to please your manager, you can also put your own logo in the top left corner, which I'm sure lots of you will enjoy doing. So you can see it's very easy to start a test the application, stop it, and then generate a report on the outcome of that testing. So that was a failover test from Hyper-V to Hyper-V. What I now want to show you is the remaining failover test operations from Hyper-V to VMware, VMware to VMware, and VMware to Hyper-V, showing you it right across the board. And rather than waiting for each one by one, I'm actually going to log into each Zerto manager behind and kick them off all at once. So here, if we go to my London Data Center 2 and the test failover option, we have the two CRMAP 2, CRMAP 1. We've already tested 1, so I'm just going to kick off 2, which is going from my Hyper-V to VMware. I'll leave it on the most recent point in time and then start the failover test. And if we come across to my VMware Data Center 2, test failover, we'll start the test on CRMAP 3, going from VMware to VMware. And then finally, my Boston DC1 VMware, failover test, CRMAP 4, from VMware to Hyper-V. So now that's kicking off in the background. We've got Zerto performing a lot of operations between different hypervisors, so I'm going to give it a little bit of time just to kick all of that off and get all of the failover test VMs running. And while we're waiting for that, I'm going to show you some of the new workflows that we have coming in Zerto 4.0, where it really does expand on the ease of use, especially in larger environments, for configuring and managing the virtual protection groups. So here in my Boston Data Center 1 VMware Zerto Virtual Manager, I'm going to create a new virtual protection group to show you the new workflows. I'm going to create this for my SharePoint application. And here you can see the priority and quality of service setting, which means that if there is contention on the link between the sites, we will start to prioritize the replication of the applications based on this setting. And a great use case for this is, say for example you have an application that you only need replicating once a day or maybe once a week, then if the bandwidth is available and data is changing inside that application, then you may as well have it replicated to a recent point in time. The only time you don't want it replicating is if the bandwidth becomes constrained, and that puts at risk the SLAs around your more important applications, which is exactly why you would put them as low here and then your high priority applications as high, which is exactly what I'm going to do for my SharePoint application. I'm then going to select the virtual machines to protect that form this application, and this is just simply a list of all the virtual machines in the source vCenter or system center that I'm creating this protection group from. And you can see the ability to define the boot order, where I can obviously set a database VM to come online in front of a web front end or an application server. I then select what I want to replicate to in terms of my target site, and because I have both VMware and Hyper-V instances configured, you can see I can select either as my replication target, because this is the new Zerto Hypervisor agnostic replication and recovery feature. For this just quick demo, I'm going to select VMware as my target, and it's a target vCenter, it's not VCD integrated. And then I select my target host, cluster, or resource pool, a target data store, a service profile, which you can set different service profiles and apply them across the board, or you can customize them where you can set a different journal history for each application, which is the time frame to keep changes for in the target site, allowing you to rewind back in time. The target RPO alert is purely an alarm that if the continuous replication and recovery point objective goes above 5 minutes, then we will let you know that you're breaching your SLAs, but the replication is always continuous, and if nothing's changing, nothing is replicating. So if we can give you a 15 or less second RPO, then Zerto will do. And the test reminder, again, is just an alarm that if this protection group hasn't been tested within this time frame specified, then again, it's breaching its SLAs, and we will let you know. We then configure the target storage, where you can actually send different VMs or VMDKs or VHDXs to different data stores, and you can perform bulk operations to send them, different disks in group. We also have the ability to go from thick to thin for disks, and the swap disk feature is extremely cool and very powerful, and especially large Microsoft SQL servers, because if you place the SQL tempdb on a separate disk, select swap disk here, then we will do an initial replication of the disk so that when you click to recover, the OS and SQL work with no user interaction, but then we don't waste any bandwidth replicating subsequent changes to tempdb, which are simply going to be lost when you boot the VM. And we typically see this save up to 50% of the replication traffic, but not only that, you're also saving 50% of your journal space and 50% of the I/O usage on the source replication appliances. So it's a win-win-win all around. Definitely recommend this feature. We then select our recovery site settings for the networks in terms of our failover network. So this should be a production port group to connect the virtual machines to when recovering, and then a failover test network so that you are using an isolated network with no routing to production for your DR testing. A recovery folder. You can see the ability to select the scripts, and now we have the new NIC configuration page where you can see all of the network adapters inside each of the VMs, and from this tabular view here you can edit all of the failover and test failover IP information, and hopefully for the 4.0 release we'll actually include the ability to import and export from CSV on this screen as well. We then have the long-term retention functionality, where if you want to keep more than 5 days of information past the journal, you can configure this backup functionality from your replicated data to a target repository, which simply gives you some portable compressed flat files where you can restore the VMs to any Zerto manager, system center or vCenter. And I quite like this feature as an ultimate failsafe, in that you have your continuous replicated copies of your data, and then obviously that is relying on the target system center or vCenter. If you were to have an issue with that, then by having this offsite copy using the Zerto backup functionality, then it is a true failsafe, because you're always going to have a copy of those virtual machines on whatever retention period and schedule you define here, where it really is your last resort and your final place that you can go to recover your virtual machines, applications and data. Excuse me, sorry, I'm not configuring that, so I'll click next, and then we can just see a general summary here of what we're going to do, and if we click done, then Zerto will just start to perform an initial sync of these virtual machines in the background, and when that's finished, it then will get into the continuous data protection state, which we can see for my existing virtual protection groups running here. So what I'd now like to do is come back to the failover test operations that we started before we went through the new VPG workflow. And if we come across here to my system center, and we'll just refresh the virtual machines in both of these. Also load my two vCenters. I'll just pull these across here. So if we go first for my CRMAP2 application that's replicating from Hyper-V to VMware, we can see we have the testing recovery VMs recovered from Hyper-V into my ESXi vCenter, and I can open the console and let's actually check my first Cross-Hypervisor recovery. And here you can see the exact same web application and the ability to log in and successfully recover the virtual machine from Hyper-V to VMware. As far as the application and the VM is concerned, it is running exactly the same as it was before, and you can see I can access the data and everything is working absolutely fine in this isolated network. I'll just close this down. We can see the failover test from VMware to VMware for my CRMAP3 application behind. Again, I'll just log in and check that the data is here. That's logged in, and we can see again another successful DR test. And then finally, just to finish up the testing, here we have my CRM4 application, which was replicating and is being recovered from VMware into Hyper-V. And if we load the web server on here, and we'll just log into this final Sugar CRM instance. And there you go, successful DR test from VMware into Hyper-V. And so we can see across the board, whether it's VMware to VMware, Hyper-V to Hyper-V, or VMware to Hyper-V or vice versa, it doesn't matter anymore. Zerto is able to replicate, protect, and recover your virtual machines irrespective of the underlying hypervisor. And just a note on, in the presentation I touched on VMware tools and host integration tools. Then obviously to keep that recovery time objective down, I definitely recommend having the VMware tools already installed in a VM if it's going to be recovered in Hyper-V. And of course the VM does have to be running in VMware or Hyper-V in order to install the relevant tools. But a word of note is obviously if you're using Hyper-V and Server 2012, then the host integration tools are already installed anyway. So it's something that you need to be aware of, and it is something that you can plan in advance to have the right tools and services installed for that target hypervisor to ensure a consistent and timely recovery. So one final thing I'd just like to show for you is in this environment here you can see I've got two system centers, two vCenters, a Zerto virtual manager for each, and it looks absolutely fantastic. I'm sure you'll agree. But one challenge here is that when you have quite a large environment with multiple vCenters and system centers, then you can start to ask some questions in terms of, okay, how do I see the overall health of my entire estate? And that's actually where the Zerto Cloud Manager can come into play, and this is used by some of our larger enterprises and also, of course, our cloud providers, where in this single interface for our Zerto Cloud Manager, this is included in the licensing. It's not an additional product at all. It's included in the normal standard licenses. If we come to sites, then here you can see from the Zerto Cloud Manager, I can see the status of and manage all of my individual data centers, and whether they're VMware or Hyper-V, they can all be viewed and managed from this interface with the ability to apply consistent service profiles across the board. And from one screen I can see each of my virtual protection groups irrespective of hypervisor or location, its actual recovery point objective, when it was last tested, and if there are any alerts and anywhere in my environment, on the alerts tab I'm going to see that here as well. But obviously my demo lab is behaving very well and I've got nothing to alert them. So you can see from this interface you can create a scalable, manageable BCDR solution across as many different hypervisors and sites as your infrastructure requires. And that concludes my demo of Zerto 4.0 for Microsoft Hyper-V and VMware. And hopefully from the demo that you've seen there, you can agree that Zerto has now delivered all the same functionality that we gave for VMware in your Hyper-V environment. And that is why we have now set the new standard for enterprise disaster recovery and replication for Microsoft Hyper-V by being hypervisor agnostic, storage agnostic, delivering an RPO of seconds, an RTO of minutes, with simple enterprise class BCDR. And then finally, as I'm sure one question you're all thinking of asking me right now is, when is this going to be out? And it is still in very early beta phases, but we are on track for a very early January release. And please keep posted. We'll definitely keep you updated. And if you're interested in joining the beta, then please let me know and I'll see what I can do. So just give me something in the chat window and I'll try and get you on the program. And thank you very much for your time.